Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Business One Zone, which includes Elk Avenue webinar for the Town of Crested Butte zoning code update. And I see we've got more attendees that'll probably be joining us as we go through. So we've got a full agenda and we're going to jump right into it. But before we do, let's start with some introductions. I'm Miles Graham and I'll be moderating today, and I'm joined by Mel Yema and some other town staff.
Hi everyone, I'm Mel Yama, Community Development Director.
And Jesse
I'm Jesse Early. I'm current planning manager and senior planner here at the town.
and Dara.
Dara McDonald, Town Manager. It's good to see everyone today.
And Kayla.
And I am Caitlin Archambault. I'm a planner with the town of Crested Butte. My camera is not functioning, but I'm here and excited to get started.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And as it shows on the screen here, we've got a pretty full agenda. The zoning code update has a lot of details, so we're going to try to set it up with some big picture understanding so we know why we're updating the code, how we're going about it, and what the process looks like. From there, we're going to dive into some details on the specific changes that are being considered for this zone, the B1 zone, and that includes Elk Avenue. And we want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. So it's been working out to about 20 minutes in this series of webinars, and there's going to be opportunities for follow-up after you have a chance to process this information. You will receive an email with a survey link and the recording of this webinar, along with a link to some more information and ways to contact the planning team. But today, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So on the next slide, you'll see a QR code, and that will allow you to use your phone and pull up a Mentimeter polling that we'll be using as we go throughout here. And it looks like, but we just have the one attendee on. So if you want to use this QR code, you can pull it up, or you can go to menti.com, and it looks like you're already on and situated there. So our first question is, in a single word, what do you love most about your zone? And it can be your neighborhood if you're a business owner on Elk. It can be the B1 zone. We just want to know what you love about your zone. And if the Menti is not convenient as we go through, I also want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom command bar. You can use that function as well if it's easier for you. It looks like we have another attendee joining us here. So if you're joining us late, we're just into the first slide on the Mentimeter polling that we're doing. We want to know what you love most about your zone. You can go to menti.com and use the code that will stay at the top of the screen during this entire webinar, or you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom tab and enter your responses there as well. And I'm not seeing anything. This first one on a Friday morning can be, just more of a warm-up question. So we do have a lot to cover. Once we move on past this slide, you'll always be able to use that Q&A button. So you can tell us what you love most about your zone, and the B1 zone on Elk Avenue is what we're covering today. So you can use that Q&A function, but let's go ahead and keep moving. And it does look like everybody's on the Menti now. So we'll have some. Oh, great. Community. And that's been a common theme that we've heard so far. I think this is our fourth webinar we've been doing on the zoning code update. The community, the neighbors, the location has been common themes on this icebreaker slide. So with that, why don't we get rolling into the rest of our presentation?
All right, thanks, Miles. So I'm going to dive into the big picture. Why are we updating the code and how are we going to go about it? So many of us, we love Crested Butte and its small town charm and sense of community. But we've been experiencing a lot of challenges as a community. A lot of change has been and is happening to us and around us, and we've been reacting really incrementally. So a lot of growth is happening to us and around us, surrounding the town. Crested Butte itself is landlocked and limited in development potential. And this really high demand with that limited space is resulting in these imbalances in our market where the free market is really catering to more amenities, tourism, luxury. Think of the high-end restaurant, the boutique hotel, the $5 million single family home. while community needs, those needs of our everyday community of people that live and work here, housing that they can afford, childcare, tradespeople, an affordable place to eat, have been publicly subsidized for a really long time. So the town's been doing that with housing and spaces for nonprofits for quite a long time. And it's led to this bifurcation that's really not sustainable. And with a lot of that, a lot of our community livability and affordability is eroding. So now's the time to really be proactive and identify and work towards the future our community wants. Can we guide growth to better meet our community needs? How can we be really strategic about the remaining development potential in Crested Butte and try to bring some balance back into the market through a mix of regulations and incentives? And in general, code is a really big process and it takes a lot of work and commitment, but it hasn't been done for maybe 40, 50 years. And there's a reason for that because it's hard work. And we didn't want to just say, hey, let's change our code to this. We really wanted to do this in a really thoughtful, intentional way with the community. And that starts all the way back in 2021 with the Community Compass. So first we needed to identify if we want our code to be a reflection of our values, what are our community's values and goals? And we spent a lot of time with you all, with the community during that process to identify those goals and values for the town. From there, how do we go about meeting those goals? What are our more specific visions, plans, and strategy when it comes to transportation mobility, when it comes to land use in our community plan, when it comes to climate action, to historic preservation? All of those subsequent plans got a little bit deeper of, okay, what's our strategy going to be with this goal, with this topic? And then from there, those directly influence our regulations and programs. We want our zoning code to be a direct reflection of what's identified in those plans, of what's in the compass. Same with our housing strategy, same with our building code. And then those directly influence everything you see on the ground, the new housing project, the new capital improvement project, the new park. All of those in the end should really tie back to our community values. So the Community Compass identified 4 key values for the Crested Butte community: that we are an authentic, accountable, connected, and bold community. And then it identified 7 key goals that the town council has been focused on for the next 5 years. All of these goals and values really influence everyday decision making by the town council, our different plans and processes, and our annual budgeting process. And a lot of these goals are interconnected and relate really well together, but a lot of them can have natural conflicts too. So specifically when it comes to land use and the community plan and the zoning code, we really tried to look at what is that interplay between accommodating growth in a way that maintains the town and Valley's rural feel, with enabling people who live and work here to thrive. So the community plan took it a step deeper. How do we work between those 2 goals? How do we have a thriving community while still retaining our small town feel? So it had the goal of looking at how can we improve the livability, functionality, and sense of community in Crested Butte by leveraging the town's development regulations to thoughtfully guide free market investment in community serving housing and spaces for businesses and nonprofits. The community plan was not a new 5-year housing plan. What housing is the town going to build? It was all about how do we use our development regulations, our framework, to have the free market be a better player in meeting the goals and objectives of the town. And the 2 key objectives of that plan was to expand, diversify, and distribute community serving housing. We've done a really great job of this so far. It's really exciting to say that 1/4 of the town's housing stock is actually deed restricted in some form to be a long-term rental, to be owner occupied, to be required for the local workforce. 1/4 is quite a lot, but we know we still have challenges and we want to make sure we really keep distributing that across town. Think of how successful ADUs are. Think of neighborhoods like Paradise Park. Think of the big mix of different housing that we have. How can we build on that? But the community plan then introduced a new objective around facilitating, creating, and preserving community serving spaces. Our housing costs are just one piece of our cost of living affordability pie as a person. And we're seeing groceries that are more expensive, childcare that's harder to access. Transportation costs can become high if you aren't able to live close to where you work. How can we look at the commercial side of things to make sure that we have community serving needs met in the community too? So the plan looked at different areas of town and identified a different vision and recommended key tools to explore in the zoning code to look at how can we give some flexibility and incentives in exchange for those needs of community serving housing and or community serving commercial spaces. So as you can see here, different tools were looked at in different areas, knowing it's not a one size fits all approach. A lot of our neighborhoods in different areas are really unique and quirky, and we love that and we want to respect that through this process. And as you can see, not a lot of major changes were proposed for Elk Avenue, knowing it is our downtown historic core, heart of our historic district. So there's some tweaks we're going to be looking at in our zoning code, but we're not talking about any drastic changes today. So the community plan identified the vision and recommended the tools, but now we need to make it happen. So the zoning code update that we're talking about today is all about enabling that vision to happen, making sure our development regulations and framework allow the things we're talking about to happen and aren't preventing them. And then at the same time, we are developing a new housing strategy and community spaces strategy to complement the zoning code. What are those projects? What are those programs? Are there financial incentives that we also need to bring to the table to really make this vision come to life? At the same time, before the community plan, we developed our first ever historic preservation plan. And that really identified a new approach to going about historic preservation and recognizing we love our history and we've been so good at protecting it. But how do we protect the evolution of our history over time and not lock everything into our mining history? How do we keep protecting that while protecting those other eras too and showing our stories as we evolve as a community? So that is going to directly influence an update to the design standards, which complement and go with our zoning code. And we'll dive into setting the stage for that today and how to participate in that process that's about to kick off too. So back to the zoning code. To update the zoning code, we have a three-step process. Since the community plan was adopted back in July, we've been doing a lot of internal review and preparation on our existing code. There's a lot of cleanup, updating definitions, looking at inconsistencies, seeing how things work to really just get our first draft and framework going. And then we held a lot of BOZAR work sessions. The Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, they enforce our zoning code and make decisions based on that. So we've had a lot of work sessions on what's working well, what's not, what do you want to see in the future. Now we're in our community outreach phase where we're doing these code webinars. This is number 4 of 7. And then an open survey that's open until December 19th to give your feedback on here's the first draft of proposed considerations. At the same time, we're also doing a technical and market analysis of some of those proposed incentives identified in the community plan. Then this winter and spring, we'll refine and draft more and refine and draft more based on your feedback. If you participate in the Compass, you might know we rewrote it 7 times. The community plan, we only had to rewrite it 2 times, which was a bit of an improvement, but we're going to be doing lots of outreach to really make sure your voices are heard. Your ideas are so great to make this code great and reflect our community's values. So please continue to stay engaged. So we want to hear from you. What are your preferred ways to engage in the zoning code update? Do you like these kinds of webinars and surveys? Do you prefer open houses or more in-person things? Do you like to go to council and BOZAR meetings, or can we get more creative? We've already heard some feedback about going to the different zones and meeting on site in the neighborhoods. And that was a great idea for the next phase. So let us know what you think.
And if you're late in joining us today, you can go to menti.com at the top of the screen and use that code to participate in this survey. And if you want a quicker, easier option, you can always go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type your responses there too while you get on the Menti for those who may be joining us a little late.
Awesome. So webinars, open houses, I think with all of it, we need to make sure there's a mix of ways to participate and involve because everyone's different. So what's guiding this process? Back in the process slide, I showed that we had a joint work session with council and BOZAR to really come to alignment of what are our guiding strategies for the code. And these are the 5 that really resonated. And I'm really excited about these 5 strategies because they're not big surprises. They really are like the executive summary of if you combine the community plan with the preservation plan with the historic Oh, I'm sorry, with the climate action plan and the transportation mobility plan, it really is all of those plans together and a good reflection of the compass. So, number one, let's simplify the code. Let's really make sure the code is really clear, easy to understand, and not just the code itself, but also our development review processes. If you need to update something on your house, if you need to do a new development, how do we make sure the code is process is really simple, consistent, and easy to understand? Number two, retain our small town feel. One of our big goals from the compass, we love that small town feel of Crested Butte, of our scale and the feel of our buildings, but it's also that small town lifestyle of really knowing your neighbors, walking down the street and knowing someone that bring that all together. Number three, strengthen historic preservation as we go about a new approach to preservation than we've been doing in the past. How do we make sure we really don't make that stronger and don't lose on all that amazing work that we've done so far? Number four, integrate land use with transportation and climate action. How do we modernize and update our land uses and make sure our framework is setting up more opportunities to live closer to where they work, where there's more choices to not have to commute, to not have to drive as far, and making sure that's really well integrated with our other goals. And then lastly, link zoning to community benefits, really looking at evaluating and implementing those incentives identified in the community plan in those different areas of town to make sure our code produces those needs our community needs, community serving housing and community serving spaces. So as a first start, and just seeing these for the first time, which of these strategies are most important to you? And you can totally say, I need more time to think about this. And the survey does ask you this again. So you have lots more time to think about it. But we'd love to hear in a first reaction, do any of these strategies resonate with you? Some retain small town feel.
And one of the themes that came up in some of the previous webinars here that also entered into the Q&A later is that linkage of zoning to community benefits and aligning our zoning code with our community values and how that ties to affordability. I'm sure will be something we'll discuss in the Q&A, but it looks like we've got some other returns here on simplifying the code and strengthening historic preservation, integrating with land use and integrating land use with transportation and climate action, and then certainly retaining that small town feel.
Awesome. It's great to see a great spread that all of these strategies are important to you all. All right, so enough of me talking. Let's turn it over to Jesse to dive into the details.
And with
So,
that, oh, Jess, you want me to cover this one?
no, yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Before we dive in, Jesse's going to walk into what we're looking at with our current zoning, and then also what the proposed changes are. But before we get into the details, we want to know from you, how familiar are you with the current zoning code? Are you coming at this just trying to understand what zoning is, or on the other end of the continuum here, do you feel very well versed in the town zoning map, maybe even follow zoning trends nationally? But this is something that we just want to get a baseline. And then as we go through this more detailed part of the webinar, that's where that Q&A button will be really helpful. As you have questions, drop them into that chat and we'll discuss them later. You're also going to be able to raise your virtual hand and ask your questions. There can be a bit of a discussion as well. But before we enter into that, we were just looking for this quick little poll here. And it looks like we've got some familiarity with the rules of your own zone. And with that, I think that's a good baseline right in the middle. So we'll use that as where we start, and then we'll jump into the more detailed presentation that Jesse's going to walk us through. And again, as you guys have questions, just drop them into that Q&A function, and we'll discuss afterwards. Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Miles. So I appreciate everyone thinking about that question because we didn't want to just jump in assuming everyone knew what zoning was. So I am going to give a quick overview. Some of you are very familiar with zoning, so hang tight. But zoning is basically the way a city or a town divides its land into different areas called zones to control how property can be used and developed. Each zone has its own rules about the four things you see on the screen. So what type of use can be on that property, the density allowed on the properties, and we call that floor area ratio or FAR. We'll get into that more later. And then how do the buildings fit on the property? So with things like parking, lot measurements, setbacks, those things. And then there are lots of other regulations that then regulate those lots even further, demolition, floodplain, ROA, and those kind of things. So with those things in mind, the main goal of zoning is to make sure that the land within our town or towns in general are used in a way that's safe and organized and in a way that supports the community's plan for overall growth. Next slide, please. So understanding that piece of the zoning, there are lots of things that come together, and there are multiple factors that regulate development. For instance, all these things come together to make sure that projects are safe, appropriate, and consistent with our community's goals, as I mentioned. For our town, zoning code is just one piece of that. Design standards is another piece of that. And then building codes, for instance, and subdivision codes all come together. And then together, all these layers come together to shape how the development happens. So balancing private property rights with public safety and the community vision. And these development review processes are evaluated as part of each of those applications. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I think this was the next one, Jesse.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I didn't even see it flip. Okay, so this slide looks very similar to the previous slide, but it's just ensuring that we understand that our task with this update, and Mel kind of covered this, is to ensure that these processes are easy to understand and more efficient. And so that could mean, for example, that staff could review certain projects administratively rather than every project going to the Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, or BOZAR right now, to help streamline the review process for the projects that meet our community's goals and values. And then projects that are more challenging, they could receive more layers of review, so through BOZAR or whatever is decided. So that's just one example.
And we just want to give some context before we get into the details of the zoning code update. So any changes that are being considered and that are eventually adopted would influence development going forward. So this isn't something of saying, hey, you now have to change this use or this setback or your parking on your site. It would only influence development going forward. And with our context, Crested Butte is pretty built out, and we do have really strong demolition regulations that limit that. So on this map, you can see what vacant parcels there are left in town. So in general, a lot of the changes we're talking about will be slow and incremental, but will have an influence in the long term. So let's dive into the B1 zone. B1 is our business and historic core of Elk Avenue, and its intent is really to focus on shops, services, and sales tax generating uses that keep our downtown really vibrant while allowing residential as a secondary use. So this is a first draft of our proposed updated map here. No changes to the boundaries of the B1 zone are being considered. It's still these 3 blocks of Elk Avenue, but I do want to run through a couple other changes we're looking at as far as the zoning map goes. So when it comes to historic preservation, as we started to set the stage for, Currently, our entire town boundary is the boundary of our local historic district, meaning everything built within the town needs to be built to the design standards to make it look like it came from our mining era of our history. The historic preservation plan said, hey, how about we continue to really preserve and protect our historic core and a buffer around it as our mining era period of significance, but then look at other areas of town differently when it comes to design standards. So, what we're exploring here in the first draft of the zoning map is overlay zones for historic preservation. So, what this red outline is here is the mining era period of significance, the historic core with a buffer around it, meaning that it's an overlay zone. So if you're developing or building something within that zone, you follow those historic preservation rules and you go to that chapter of the design standards all about the mining era. Then the historic preservation plan proposed a second era of period of significance to reflect the town's transition from a coal mining town into a recreation ski town. So what you're seeing on here are any parcels that are highlighted in this kind of hatched pattern are all the buildings built during that period from the mid 60s to the mid 80s. And those are currently being surveyed for architectural significance, integrity, and qualities that are really reflective of that area. So depending on that survey, there would be a new overlay district created. It'll likely be a lot less parcels than what's on here now, because again, this is everything in that era and we're going to survey it. And then if you fall into that overlay zone, you would reference the next chapter of the design standards saying, okay, here's your design standards around make reflecting that period of history, and knowing there's a lot of different types of styles from that period. There's mid-century modern, there's log cabin, so it'll really be set up to be really flexible and work with that and not make everything fit in one box. And then outside of those two, anything outside of those two districts would be looking at standards and for design around mass, scale, form, and orientation, but allow a lot more flexibility for architectural design and roof forms and windows and all that sort of thing. So that coming up with those standards is what we'll be doing as we kick off the design standards, which we'll touch on again at the end. But so in general with Elk Avenue, because it is the heart of our town, we're not looking at a lot of big changes. Through this update, we're looking to clarify our uses and definitions, looking at right sizing and tweaking our parking requirements, and then exploring more deed restricted housing while maintaining ground floor commercial, recognizing the intent of this zone is really commercial sales tax generating first, residential secondary. So before we dive into the details on each provision, we want to hear from you. What are some challenges you might be experiencing in this zone? And some themes that we've heard so far from other zones have been parking, snow storage, affordability, challenges with mixed use of like commercial uses mixing with residential. We want to hear from you all.
And thanks, Mel. That's exactly where I was thinking about our themes from yesterday's mixed use zoning webinar and some of the intensity of uses from the business district that were spilling over into that mixed use area. So here for the B1 zone on Elk, what challenges are you all seeing in this particular area? The open-ended ones are always a little more time consuming where you don't have a pool of options and multiple choice. And again, in the interest of time, what we can do is use that Q&A function as we get into it. Okay, excellent. Here we go. We've got traffic, loud delivery trucks, barriers for Coal Creek, pedestrian safety and snow removal. We've heard that at the Coal Creek Walkway in particular, behind your building. And a thank you and a thank you for sharing that feedback. It's really tracking with a lot of what we've been hearing as well. So very helpful to identify some common themes here. And again, we can keep this moving. If we miss your comment, if it comes in as we transition, drop it in that Q&A and we'll discuss.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. All right, on to specific provisions.
Okay, so many zone districts have a litany of uses like this one. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, that's our current zoning code for the B1 zone. And there are a list of permitted uses and conditional uses. Permitted means that those uses can be done by right with no approval. And then conditional means that some level of review is required. For the town of Crested Butte, currently that means Bozar would review those applications. One of the movements within this zoning code update is to change to a dwelling unit, and overall in the update, rather than using the terms duplex, triplex, and multifamily, which don't so much apply to this zone district for duplex and triplex, but just mentioning that. So for this zone district, I'll try and quickly overview the uses for the zone, so you have ideas of the things that are being kept and changed and taken out. So the things that are going to be kept are public transit stops, public recreation trails, public museums, lodging, office uses, retail commercial establishments, and local serving retail establishments, micro distilleries, restaurants, bars, and we would make all these permitted uses rather than conditional uses, as many of them are right now. The other thing I forgot to mention is home occupation. It's not currently in the code right now, but assuming if someone does have a residence, they could do a home occupation in that residence. Dwelling units, accessory buildings, public transit facilities, light industrial would all be examples of things that would be conditional uses in the proposed zoning code update. Some of the things we would clean up is office uses. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of different things that probably could qualify as office uses, but over time they were added into the code as their own specific use. So we're consolidating those and will help to define those within the definitions. The other thing we will be keeping would be the horizontal zoning regulations that don't allow specific office uses on the first floor of a building unless they're more than a certain linear feet back from the Elk Avenue corridor. So that is something that would be kept, and the language of that would be kept. So just to call that out. We'd be adding restricted food service. So something basically like Roomers functions as a restricted food service where they serve prepackaged foods, but they don't actually make food there and serve beverages and stuff like that. And then congregate housing would also be added as a conditional use within this zone. The things that would be removed would be open use recreation sites, hospitals, rental, repair, and wholesaling, parking areas, clubs and recreation clubs, fraternities and sororities, and funeral parlors and mortuaries.
And just wanted to mention the light industrial piece and conditional is something we're still thinking about in our minds. We were trying to account for things like coffee roasters and those types of uses, not like welding shops. So knowing we do have a commercial zone for that. So that's something we're still kind of thinking through. Is there maybe more specific definitions to really enable those kinds of like shop crafts and things, but not full light industrial. So that's a piece of feedback we'd love feedback on. So on to parking, everyone's favorite topic. The way the zoning code regulates parking is it requires off-street parking requirements on your own private property. And we currently have absolute requirements around for a restaurant. You have to have one space for every 500 square feet of usable space, and then it ramps up from there. And like retail or office, one space per 500 square feet of usable space. And just in the image below, I just want to clarify of what private off-street parking is in the yellow, you're parking on your private property. And then we have public on-street or right-of-way parking. So like the spots on 3rd Street or in Elk Avenue that are publicly accessible, but may come with management. So for example, in these areas, they do have 2-hour parking requirements there. So what we're proposing for the updated code is with commercial uses to not really change them, but take a look at industry standards just to make sure they're modernized and updated for best practices. But what we do want to look at is updating our payment in lieu of parking fee. It's quite out of date and really not reminiscent with the actual cost to construct a parking space. But we do recognize that it is a high cost and can be inhibiting. So we want to look in that payment in lieu of fee of how do we update it, but do we look towards things like exemptions or things like that when it comes to local serving, community serving types of businesses? Is there a way to reduce the barrier there? The idea behind this is that by leveraging payment in lieu, how can we put more resources and support into really shared multimodal and parking and those sorts of transportation solutions versus really putting a lot of money and investment into a single serving parking for a single serving development? How could we leverage more funding then to go towards more transit, park and rides, those sorts of things? Knowing we're a small community, we have a lot of parking that we could better effectively use and really build on that great multimodal network we have here. Then when it comes to residential units, what we're proposing is to have a lower minimum instead of an absolute requirement to really take out the control of saying you have to have this many spaces, knowing some people probably have less cars and some people have more, but let them and the market decide for their needs of what's a marketable product. So what we're proposing is that for residential units, a minimum of 1 space per unit, or with an option for payment in lieu in this area. And then for deed restricted residential units, no minimum. And this could lead to leveraging things like parking permits on Sopris and Maroon for those residents to make sure they do have a place to park, but that we're not requiring it as part of the development. And we do have some situations like that in this area currently.
Okay, specific to lot measurements, Mel kind of already mentioned but we would remove the minimum lot size and the minimum lot width with the understanding that setbacks, parking, FAR kind of help to regulate what the size of the lot is going to be. We would keep the maximum at 9,375 square feet, and much of that relates to FAR, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Next slide, please. Relating to setbacks, currently the setbacks exist at 0 feet, and so we would keep that. There would be a maximum added of 5 feet proposed to encourage buildings to address the street rather than being set back from the street. So that's one proposed change. For side yard setbacks, we don't have any real proposed changes other than the fact that flat roof buildings could be at 0 feet, which is more consistent with the rest of the commercial zones. And then rear yard setbacks would remain at 10 feet. And that stems from the fact that a lot of commercial buildings along Elk Avenue need to have mechanical equipment in the back or dumpsters, recycling, and those function in the back that way.
So in all of our different zone districts in the code today, there's a section called additional provisions, which is a big catch-all for those provisions that don't necessarily fit into the other categories. For the B1 zone, this currently limits residential uses to not more than 50% of the building area. It has specific requirements for roof slope and wall heights, and then it has requirements for stream margin review or floodplain permit processes for uses within 20 feet of a designated water course, or Coal Creek in this case. What we want to do with this section is first, we really want to explore that 50% residential use limit. We're looking at evaluating it to see if we would consider allowing residential to exceed the 50% if it's for the purposes of deed restricted housing. So for just market rate housing, you could go have 50%, but we would allow potentially more than that if that additional percentage was deed restricted, so long as commercial is still maintained on the ground floor. Going back to that original intent that this zone is really intended for business first, residential secondary. Then for things like roof forms and other design provisions, we really are looking at where does that best live, to go back to that strategy of be really simple and clear, looking at how making sure that those roof forms are updated to provide more flexibility in the design standards update and have them live in the design standards and not the zoning code. And then lastly, with floodplain, instead of having those requirements live within each zone, those would function more as an overlay zone, like the historic districts, where if you fall within that overlay within that 20 feet of a designated water course and floodplain requirements, then you would be required to adhere to floodplain permitting procedures, but not have it kind of live buried within each zone, and just make those procedures really clear.
Okay, so floor area ratio, or FAR, is the way we measure how much building can be constructed on a piece of land, and is basically the ratio of a building's mass or volume to the lot size. The B1 zone currently has 3 levels of ranges of FAR based upon the lot size, which you can see on the left-hand side again of the screen. So we're looking to clean up the requirements overall. There are ranges, as I mentioned, dependent upon the lot size, but these ranges aren't really used. And most people, if they're proposing an FAR or a square footage, it's towards the high end of because costs are so high. The ranges we're not proposing to change. However, we're wanting to evaluate the higher end of the range to see if we could incentivize affordable housing or deed restricted commercial as part of that, rather than have this range just be an arbitrary number that's not really used currently in the code. The other thing we're looking at is the minimum unit size and what relates to that now. Right now that exists at 400 square feet. Is that relational to present day anymore? And then relating to building measurements, currently the height measurement for the zone district is 35 feet, and we don't propose any changes to that height requirement for the B1 zone.
So on to incentives, we kind of started to introduce this, but currently there aren't really incentives built into this zone in our current code. But what we want to do is look at that 50% residential use limit. Is that a possibility of an incentive where you could go beyond that if it was for deed restricted housing, as long as commercial was maintained on the ground floor? And then, as Jesse mentioned, with the FAR, instead of these kind of vague ranges of go to this range if you provide public benefit, can we have a really clear tie of, can you go to this FAR if you provide X% of deed restricted housing? And those are the types of market analysis we're doing right now with a firm called Economic and Planning Systems, of really modeling different areas of town, including this area, to say, okay, what would a development look like under this proposed code? What would it actually cost? And then what feasibly could we require out of that with our resident occupied affordable housing regulations, or with an incentive like what we're proposing?
Relating to demolition, our demolition ordinance was put into our code in 2019 and has pretty strong language, but what we'd be looking to do that is strengthen that language within that ordinance. So basically, to give a quick overview, this ordinance requires that if a building is approved for demolition or relocation, it's less and exists at less than the maximum FAR. There's a requirement that the redevelopment plan would require an ADU as part of that redevelopment plan. That's with the understanding that it's not a historic building. Also, many of the buildings within the zone are commercial buildings, so it's a little different scenario than a residential building, which I'm speaking to with the redevelopment plan requiring an ADU. We would be adding a section that pertains to buildings from the new period of significance that are determined to be contributing to this new period of significance. And we'd also be looking to create incentives for stabilization and maintenance of buildings from within each period, because we recognize how costly it is to keep and maintain those buildings, and not everyone has the money to completely rehabilitate buildings, but it just be a way of making sure that those buildings aren't falling over. And we have some examples of those out there right now, unfortunately. And then finally, as Mel mentioned earlier, we're so excited. Also going to be updating our design standards. And that is going to kick off at the Beaux-Arts meeting on November 18th. And we'd love to invite you all to come if you have the time. We're going to start that meeting at 5:30, and it's going to be a work session, which will be kind of engaging. So if you can be there in person, it's great. We will have the option to be there online too. So look for that on our website. And again, as Mel overviewed earlier, that basically would just be keeping the current period of significance that represents mining, looking to create that new period of significance, which represents early recreation from 1961 to 1984, and then revising those sections outside of those two periods of significance to move towards standards that just relate to mass scale and form, so that it would enable more flexibility relating to design and style of buildings.
Thanks, Jesse. So we know that was a lot to digest, and we're going to get into Q&A here in a moment where you're going to be able to raise your hand and ask questions or continue to put them in that Q&A function that we have going. But we want you to know that you will have time to process all of this and respond at a more granular level in the survey that is open now and will be emailed to all of our participants after this meeting. And we see we have a few new attendees joining us, so you can always scan that QR code here and go straight into the survey. And the email that follows will include all of this information as well as a link to a fact sheet about the B1 zone. If you want to participate in more webinars coming up, we've got our B2 zone next week on the 11th, followed by the C district on the 12th. And on November 20th, we're going to dive into the residential district. So we're officially right at the halfway point in these zoning webinars. And again, as Mel said, this is just the first step in a lot of outreach that will happen as we look at updating the code. So with that, Mel, anything else before we dive into Q&A?
Yeah, and so we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar to you all. So please share it with your colleagues, your neighbors, your friends. And then on the website there too, we do have a fact sheet for each zone, which does kind of as a simple sheet around the different current and proposed provisions that we talked about today, but you can access it in a document form.
Excellent. Thanks, Mel. And so for Q&A, we've got one in our Q&A function, and this is the time where you can click on that raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to unmute and ask your question as well, or you can always drop it in the Q&A. But the first question is from Bud. Great clarification question on any proposed changes to the horizontal office zoning. And I know, Jesse, I think you covered that earlier, but any clarifications you want to provide on the horizontal office zoning?
Yeah, Miles, that's a good question, Bud. So the horizontal zoning, we would propose to remain the same as it is now. So first floor office uses would be prohibited unless it's more than a certain linear feet back from the Elk Avenue sidewalk. It would be allowed on second and third floor. But I'm happy to answer any other questions if you have other questions about that.
And just going back to that original intent of the zone of being focused on sales tax generating uses, that's not something at this time we're looking at changing, which is why we're proposing to keep that consideration the same.
And I don't see any other questions or hands up. So I think that's a great example of the intent. And while the current and proposed language, changed a little bit on that slide, the intent really does stay the same as Jesse and Mel have indicated. Any other questions from our attendees this morning? You can raise your virtual hand or drop your questions in the chat. And I know this zone, while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, as Mel and Jesse have said, this zone largely, the changes are more refinements rather than changes, and a lot of the intent and the uses will remain the same, which could be why we maybe don't have any additional questions at this time. And Bud just chimed in here on the Q&A. Thank you for your thoughtful consideration and inclusiveness in the process. And Bud and everyone, thank you for taking the time today. This is, very early in the zoning code update process. We're going to be sharing more information. The survey is going to stay open until December 19th. So we'll be able to report those results back and how they've informed that first draft of the plan. There will be subsequent drafts after that. So without seeing any additional questions or hands up, I think we can maybe go to our closing statements. Melanie, any final thoughts you want to share? And I'll keep watching the Q&A.
Yeah, just thank you all so much for joining us. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you'd like to meet individually, ask more specific questions, share additional feedback outside of that survey. We're always happy to meet and talk more. This stuff's really complicated and complex, and each zone and block and area and provision is really unique and has context, and you all see it every day. So we'd love your input and are really excited to work with you all through this code update.
Thanks, Mel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. You'll see some follow-up emails, and as Mel said, please do share that with your friends and neighbors so that we can get as much input as possible at this stage in the zoning code update and drafting process.
Thank you all so much.